In the vast expanse of the galaxy, distant stars twinkled quietly, each one a silent witness to the countless stories of civilizations, both known and forgotten. Some planets thrived, their people prosperous and powerful, while others struggled, their desperate cries for help lost in the void of space. For centuries, the stars had been the domain of the great and mighty, who held dominion over their planets, their systems, and their future. Yet, one after another, these powerful civilizations found themselves on the brink of extinction, unable to protect themselves from the forces that threatened to wipe them out. There were countless calls for help, but none of the galactic powers seemed to listen. They were too busy with their own struggles, their own ambitions, their own politics. To them, the pleas of the weaker species were just noise. One planet, a small but ancient civilization, had reached out in desperation. Their people were caught in a war they could not win, their resources dwindling and their homeworld soon to be destroyed. The message they sent was not new. It was similar to the countless others that had been broadcast across the stars. But this time, there was something different about it. The message was louder, clearer, and it contained a deep sense of urgency that none of the galaxy's leaders could ignore. It was as though the planet itself was crying out, as if the very soul of the world had reached out to the stars for a savior. "Help us," the message said. "We are losing everything. The darkness is coming. We cannot survive without aid. Please, anyone, help." The leaders of the galaxy, however, were unmoved. They had long ago dismissed the cries of weaker civilizations as nothing more than desperate pleas from doomed species. The Council, the highest authority in the galaxy, was composed of powerful and ancient species who had long been used to the idea of control and dominance. They didn't see the planet's message as an opportunity to help. They saw it as a distraction. The Council's attention was already divided by their own internal problems, and they could not afford to waste time on what they deemed to be a hopeless cause. But then something unexpected happened. A response came, one that no one had anticipated. It wasn't from one of the galaxy's elite species, nor from any of the military powers that held sway over the stars. It came from Earth, a small, insignificant planet that had barely made a mark on the galactic stage. Its inhabitants, humans, had long been considered primitive by the galaxy's standards. They had no advanced technology, no great fleets, no mighty weapons. They were nothing more than a curiosity to the more advanced species, a species that had been left alone by the Council for centuries. Yet, despite their humble beginnings, humanity responded. The decision was not made by any government or powerful faction. It was not a decision that came from the top of the human leadership structure. It came from ordinary people, those who had heard the call for help and could not ignore it. They were people who had no reason to help, no reason to care for a species they had never met, but they understood something the galactic leaders had forgotten: the value of compassion, the duty to protect those in need, even if it meant stepping out of their comfort zone. At first, no one knew what to make of it. The message from Earth was simple, almost too simple to believe. "We heard your call," it said. "We are coming to help." The galaxy laughed. The idea that a race of humans, with no military might, no grand technology, would come to the aid of an entire star system was absurd. It was laughable. The aliens dismissed it as an act of naivety, as a human attempt to be heroic for a cause that was beyond their capacity to understand. But as human ships began to take flight, heading for the distressed planet, the galaxy started to take notice. These were no grand fleets of warships. The human vessels were small, built for long journeys and survival rather than combat. The technology aboard the ships was not advanced by galactic standards. They did not possess weapons that could obliterate a fleet in a single strike. They did not have the firepower to take on entire planetary systems. But there was something else, something different about these humans that the galaxy had not anticipated. As the human ships made their way to the star system in distress, the planet's leaders were skeptical. They had heard the story of the humans. They knew their reputation, a race that had only recently left their own planet's atmosphere, with no understanding of the intricacies of galactic politics or interplanetary war. They had been seen as weak, small, and unimportant. Yet the humans had answered the call. And now they were on their way. The planet's leaders waited, unsure of what to expect. They thought that maybe the humans would arrive and offer some basic aid, perhaps some resources, a few ships to help defend their world. But as the human ships landed, they were shocked by what they saw. The humans didn't bring weapons or armies. They didn't bring fleets or warships. What they brought was something far more valuable. They brought their expertise, their ingenuity, their willingness to do whatever it took to help. The human team quickly set to work, not with grand gestures, but with small practical solutions. They used the limited resources on the planet to create tools, build shelters, repair infrastructure. Where the planet's leaders had been paralyzed by their desperation, the humans acted. They did not ask for recognition or reward. They did not seek glory or fame. They simply wanted to help. As the days passed, the desperate cries of the planet's people began to fade. They were no longer in a state of panic. With the humans working beside them, the planet's people started to believe again. They started to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and there were many challenges along the way. But the presence of the humans had sparked something in them, a sense of hope that had been long extinguished. However, not all the galaxy's species were pleased with this turn of events. The Council, whose members were all deeply entrenched in their own power, viewed the humans' actions with suspicion. They had long considered humanity to be a species too small and insignificant to matter. But now, with the humans proving themselves capable of such feats, the Council began to question their power. Were the humans truly just a primitive species, or was there more to them than anyone had realized? And so, as the humans continued to help the struggling civilizations, the galaxy's elite began to whisper in the shadows, questioning whether the humans were an asset or a threat. They had no idea that this small, seemingly insignificant species would soon change the course of the galaxy forever. The forgotten message had been heard, and the response from humanity had already begun to ripple across the stars, a ripple that would soon turn into a wave, one that would shake the galaxy to its very core. The humans had arrived, and the galaxy began to take notice. At first, the response from the galaxy's inhabitants had been one of disbelief. How could such a primitive species be capable of helping when the galaxy's greatest powers could not? Yet, as the days turned into weeks, the humans continued to work alongside the planet's people, bringing hope where there had been only despair. Slowly, the world began to change, and with it, the perceptions of those who had once dismissed humanity as nothing more than a curiosity. The humans didn't have the grand fleets or the advanced technology of the Council species, but they had something far more valuable: a work ethic, an ingenuity, and a spirit that refused to back down in the face of adversity. They didn't wait for someone else to solve the problem. They didn't stand around waiting for a perfect solution to come to them. They rolled up their sleeves, used what they had, and got to work. No task was too small, no challenge too great. In the beginning, it seemed like small victories: repairing damaged infrastructure, creating sustainable food supplies, helping the planet's population rebuild their homes, and ensuring that the people had access to medical aid. These were the basics, things that should have been done long ago. Yet the sheer determination of the humans in their efforts inspired the planet's citizens. What had once been a dying world, with little hope for the future, was slowly being transformed. As the days turned into months, the planet's leaders began to realize that the humans were not only helping with practical solutions, but they were also giving something else. They were giving the people back their dignity. They weren't just fixing problems. They were teaching the people how to solve their own problems, how to rebuild from the ground up, how to stand on their own 2 feet once more. The humans, it seemed, had a way of making the impossible seem possible. In a galaxy filled with species that relied on their advanced technology to solve every problem, humanity's approach was radically different. The humans worked with what they had, innovating as they went. They didn't rely on complex machinery or expensive resources. Instead, they used their creativity, their adaptability, and their willpower to find solutions. The leaders of the planet, who had initially doubted humanity's ability to help, now found themselves in awe. What they had expected to be a simple rescue mission had turned into something far greater. They had not just received aid. They had learned how to help themselves, how to grow stronger, how to survive. It was a lesson the galaxy's other civilizations had never considered. But while the humans were busy helping one planet, the rest of the galaxy was watching. The Council of Galactic Species, the ruling body of the galaxy, had been keeping a close eye on the human involvement. They had never taken humanity seriously. To them, humans were an insignificant species, primitive, unimportant, and lacking the sophistication of the galaxy's more advanced civilizations. They had dismissed the humans as nothing more than a temporary anomaly, something that would eventually fade into irrelevance. But the longer the humans stayed on the planet, the more the Council began to realize that their initial dismissal had been a grave mistake. The humans weren't just helping the planet. They were doing something more dangerous. They were giving hope to those who had long been oppressed, to those who had suffered under the Council's rule. They were showing that a species, even one as small and seemingly insignificant as humanity, could make a difference. They were proving that the galaxy's established order could be challenged. The Council had been content to let the weaker species struggle. It suited their purposes to have underdeveloped civilizations dependent on their protection. But now, with humanity intervening, the balance of power was shifting. The aliens of the galaxy who had once looked down on humans were beginning to question their own complacency. And as the months passed, humanity's influence grew. The human teams worked not only on practical solutions, but also on something much larger, an idea. They didn't just want to save a single planet or a single species. They wanted to change the way the galaxy viewed its less fortunate members. They wanted to show that power did not belong solely to the elite, that survival and progress were within the reach of any species, no matter their size or technological advancement. But it wasn't just the Council that noticed. Other alien civilizations, struggling to survive under the Council's rule, began to look to humanity as a beacon of hope. They saw how the humans had come to aid a world in crisis, how they had not expected anything in return, and how they had inspired the planet's inhabitants to take their fate into their own hands. It wasn't long before the first whispers of rebellion began to stir across the galaxy. And they were not just whispers. As more and more species saw the success of humanity's approach, they began to question the system that had held them down for so long. They asked themselves, why should the Council control everything? Why should they bow down to powers that were unwilling to help when the galaxy's weakest were in need? As these questions spread like wildfire, more and more species began to look to humanity for guidance. The message from Earth had sparked something that could no longer be extinguished. A new idea was taking root, an idea that the galaxy did not have to remain as it was. The established powers, the Council and its allies, had thought that their control over the galaxy was unshakable. They had never considered that a species as small and insignificant as humanity could challenge their rule. But humanity had already shown them that they were wrong. As the humans continued their work, they found themselves becoming not just rescuers but symbols. The galaxy's oppressed species began to look to them as leaders. The humans had no grand fleets or weapons to speak of, but they had something far more dangerous to the Council, an idea. And it was spreading. The Council, once confident in its dominance, began to feel the first tremors of doubt. It was clear that the humans had become something far more powerful than anyone had expected. And as the humans continued to show the galaxy what true strength meant, strength not in technology or firepower, but in heart and determination, the fate of the galaxy seemed to be slipping from their grasp. The question now wasn't whether humanity would help. They already had. The question was, what would they do next? And more importantly, how would the galaxy respond when humanity decided it was time to change everything? As the humans continued to assist the planet, the situation in the galaxy began to grow more complicated. The message of hope and self-reliance they had brought spread far beyond the borders of the planet they had initially saved. The once-forgotten message, sent from a desperate world, had turned into a rallying cry for those who had been oppressed, ignored, or enslaved by the greater powers of the galaxy. The humans had sparked something more profound than anyone could have imagined. A shift in the balance of power across the stars. The leaders of the Council, as well as the elite species that had long dominated the galaxy, began to feel the pressure mounting. What had started as a simple response to a distress signal had now turned into a movement, one that could not be ignored. Across star systems, small rebellions had begun to form, fueled by the example set by the humans. Species that had once been under the control of the Council started to question their place in the galaxy, wondering why they should continue to serve a system that had left them in the dust. They began to ask the same questions that humanity had asked all those years ago. Why not us? Why should the powerful dictate the fate of the weaker? At first, the Council responded with the same indifference they had shown when humanity's message first arrived. They dismissed the stirrings of rebellion as insignificant, the whispers of oppressed species as nothing more than empty threats. They believed that the galaxy's systems of control and power were too entrenched to be challenged by a few small uprisings. To them, humanity's involvement was little more than an annoyance, an exception in an otherwise stable system. But the growing unrest was more than just a nuisance. It was a sign of something far more dangerous. In response to the growing unrest, the Council sent emissaries to the planets where the rebellions had begun, warning them to cease their defiance or face the consequences. But these emissaries, once seen as symbols of the Council's authority, were now met with defiance. The people who had once bowed their heads in fear now stood tall, inspired by the humans who had dared to help without expectation of gain. They no longer saw themselves as powerless, but as capable of standing up to the forces that had kept them subjugated. While this was happening, the humans were not sitting idly by. They had already made it clear that they weren't just interested in offering short-term aid. They were actively working to change the way the galaxy functioned, to show that cooperation, mutual support, and respect for all species could create a better galaxy. They began to offer more than just practical help. They offered the chance for true change. They shared their knowledge of sustainable resources, peaceful conflict resolution, and a philosophy that valued life over domination. They didn't promise the stars. They promised something far more valuable: a chance to rise above the status quo. The Council, meanwhile, watched in growing alarm as more planets began to resist their rule. At first, the Council believed they could crush the uprisings with sheer force. They gathered their fleets, prepared their forces, and prepared to remind the galaxy who truly held power. But this time, the situation was different. The rebellions were not isolated pockets of resistance, but a growing movement that spread across multiple star systems. The oppressed species were no longer afraid. They had seen the humans succeed, and that had given them the courage to fight back. The humans, despite not having a grand military, had something that the Council had not anticipated: a unity of purpose. The humans did not come to the galaxy with a plan for conquest, but their example had proven to the galaxy's oppressed that cooperation and unity could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. They had inspired entire star systems to rise up and challenge the powers that had held them down for centuries. The Council, in its arrogance, had underestimated the power of hope. The first major confrontation came when one of the most powerful Council species, the Zithar, attempted to quash an uprising on a distant planet. The Zithar, known for their ruthlessness and advanced military technology, had long been a member of the Council's elite. They had no intention of allowing any resistance to disrupt the status quo. But as their forces arrived on the planet, they were met with something unexpected: humans. A small group of human fighters had been stationed on the planet, aiding the local population with defense and strategy. They didn't have the advanced weaponry of the Zithar, nor the experience in large-scale warfare. What they did have was the knowledge of the people they were fighting for, a deep understanding of how to work together in ways the Zithar had never considered. The humans didn't fight with brute force. They fought with strategy, understanding, and compassion for those they were protecting. The Zithar underestimated the humans once again. They assumed that humanity's lack of advanced military power would make them weak. But the humans had a different kind of strength. When the Zithar launched their first attack, the humans responded not with guns blazing, but with clever traps and tactical moves that allowed the planet's forces to strike when the Zithar least expected it. In a series of skirmishes, the humans and their allies began to push back the Zithar forces. It was not a decisive victory, not yet. The Zithar were still powerful, and the humans had no illusions about the fight ahead. But the message had been sent. Even a small group of humans could turn the tide against a seemingly unbeatable enemy. The rebellion on the planet gained momentum, and soon, more systems were following suit. The Zithar's arrogance had blinded them, and they were now facing an unexpected opponent. Unity, fueled by the hope humanity had brought to the galaxy. The Council, now fully aware of the growing threat, called for a meeting to discuss the situation. For the first time in centuries, the Council's members were divided. Some believed that the rebellion could be crushed with overwhelming force, while others feared that the galaxy's power structure was about to unravel. They could no longer ignore the humans. They could no longer dismiss them as irrelevant. As the debate raged on, the humans continued to spread their message, offering more than just aid. They offered a new vision for the galaxy, a vision where no species was left behind, where power wasn't defined by the ability to destroy, but by the willingness to work together for the common good. The humans didn't promise an easy future, but they promised a chance to build something better. The Council's once unquestionable dominance was beginning to slip, and for the first time, the galaxy was looking to humanity for leadership. The oppressed species, emboldened by the humans' actions, were rising up, and the galaxy was on the brink of a new era. Whether the Council could adapt to this new reality, or whether they would be swept away by the winds of change, remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the humans had ignited a spark that could not be extinguished, and with each passing day that spark was growing into an unstoppable force, one that would soon change the galaxy forever. The tension in the galaxy reached a boiling point. Rebellions had spread like wildfire, and entire star systems were now questioning the authority of the Council. What had started as a ripple, a single act of kindness and assistance from humanity, had turned into a powerful wave of defiance that threatened the very foundation of the galaxy's power structures. The humans, who had once been seen as nothing more than a primitive species, had become symbols of hope, resilience, and the possibility of a new era. The Council had been forced to take drastic measures in response to the growing unrest. For the first time, they began to recognize that humanity was not just a fleeting nuisance. They were a legitimate threat to their rule. And they knew that if the human-inspired rebellions continued to spread, their carefully constructed empire would be at risk of collapse. The balance of power, once so firmly held by the Council's elite, was shifting, and the Council had no intention of allowing that to happen without a fight. They began to assemble a coalition of their most powerful species, including the Zithar, who had been humiliated during their failed campaign against the rebellion. Together, they planned a military operation to crush the uprisings once and for all. The human influence had to be eradicated. The galaxy had to be reminded that the Council's authority was absolute. But as the Council prepared for war, they failed to see the most critical factor in the equation. They were not dealing with just another insurgency. They were up against something far more dangerous, an idea. The humans, having seen the power of unity and resistance, were not intimidated by the Council's military might. Instead of retreating or backing down, they doubled down on their message. They were not just fighters. They were teachers, advocates, and catalysts for a change that no one could stop. The humans began to share more of their philosophies with the galaxy, how cooperation between species could build a better future, how technology could be used for the benefit of all, how each species had unique strengths that, when combined, could make the galaxy a stronger, more peaceful place. As the human influence continued to grow, they began to form an alliance with the other species, who had risen up in defiance of the Council. The once divided planets, each struggling on their own, now found strength in numbers. With humanity's guidance, they were learning how to fight smarter, how to organize, and how to make their voices heard. The human-led coalition was small compared to the might of the Council, but they were united in purpose and determination. The Council, on the other hand, was divided. The more moderate members began to question the wisdom of using force to solve every problem, while the more hardline factions insisted that they had no choice but to destroy the rebellion once and for all. But the humans had already proven something that no one in the galaxy had ever considered. Power didn't have to come from domination. True power, they showed, came from the ability to inspire, to teach, and to build bridges instead of walls. The humans had begun to form alliances not just with the oppressed species, but with former enemies as well. Through diplomacy, compassion, and patience, they were changing the very nature of the galaxy's politics. The Council had never encountered a foe like this, one that didn't fight with weapons or fleets, but with ideas, with conviction, and with the promise of a better future for all species. As the human-led coalition continued to grow stronger, the Council found themselves facing a dilemma. They could continue with their plan of violent suppression, but that would only feed the fire of rebellion, galvanizing even more species to join the fight. Or they could attempt to negotiate with the human-led coalition, offering some form of compromise. But this, too, was a difficult option. The Council had ruled with an iron fist for centuries, and admitting any form of weakness would be a blow to their authority. The tipping point came when the Council was forced to confront a devastating truth. The galaxy was changing, whether they liked it or not. The old ways of maintaining control through fear and manipulation no longer held the same power they once had. The galaxy's population was waking up, and they had seen a new path forward, a path led by humans. The very species that the Council had once written off as insignificant were now leading the charge for a new future. It became clear that the rebellion was no longer just a political struggle. It was a moral one. The galaxy's inhabitants had come to realize that their true enemy was not each other, but the Council's oppressive systems that had kept them divided and subjugated for centuries. And humanity, through their willingness to help and inspire, had shown them a way out of that darkness. The Council, in their desperation, began to make concessions. At first, these were small, meaningless gestures meant to appease the growing unrest. They promised some reforms, offered negotiations with certain rebellious planets, and made token gestures to show they were willing to change. But it was too little, too late. The momentum had shifted irreparably. The galaxy's inhabitants were no longer satisfied with empty promises. They wanted real change. In the final showdown, it wasn't a battle of fleets or armies that determined the outcome. It was the strength of the idea that humanity had ignited across the galaxy. The Council's power had been based on fear, but the rebellion was built on hope. The humans had shown that cooperation, unity, and compassion could accomplish what weapons and force never could. It was a simple, yet profound lesson. As the final pieces of the rebellion fell into place, the Council was forced to surrender. The galaxy had changed, and it would never return to the way it had been. Humanity, once dismissed as a species with nothing to offer, had not only survived, they had thrived. And they had transformed the galaxy in the process. They had shown that true strength came not from destruction, but from the power of working together for the common good. The galaxy, for the first time in its history, stood united. No longer were species divided by old grudges or power imbalances. The humans had inspired them to see beyond their differences, to recognize that the future could be brighter if they worked together. And as the Council faded into the background, humanity emerged as a new beacon of hope for the galaxy, a symbol of what could be accomplished when even the smallest, most overlooked species dared to believe they could make a difference. The war was over, but the true battle, the battle for the soul of the galaxy, had just begun. And in that battle, humanity would continue to lead, showing the galaxy that no matter how dark the times, there was always hope. There was always a way forward. The galaxy had shifted. The once immovable council had crumbled, its members scattered and divided, struggling to regain any semblance of control over a galaxy that no longer feared them. The war for the galaxy's future was over, but the true work had only just begun. For all the victories won and the battles fought, humanity now found themselves at the helm of a galaxy that was in desperate need of healing, unity, and rebuilding. The question was no longer whether the galaxy would change. It had changed. Now, it was a matter of how the galaxy would rebuild itself. Humanity, the species that had once been on the outside, looking in, was now the torchbearer for a new era. The humans had proven to the galaxy that strength came not from fear, but from unity. Their message had reached across the stars. We are stronger together than we are apart. But the path ahead was not going to be easy. There were scars to heal, divisions to mend, and distrust to overcome. The old ways of thinking were deeply ingrained, and many species that had long been under the thumb of the councils struggled to accept the idea of living in a galaxy where cooperation was the new currency, not domination. In the months following the rebellion's victory, humanity's leaders were forced to walk a fine line. They had shown the galaxy what was possible, but now they had to prove that they could lead without becoming just another oppressive force. There were those who believed that humanity had earned the right to rule, to become the new power in the galaxy. These factions, though well-meaning, risked repeating the very mistakes of the old council, believing that power and control were necessary to maintain order. Humanity's true strength lay in the humility that had first allowed them to help the oppressed, not in the desire to dominate. They understood that the real work of leadership was not about holding power, but about empowering others. They didn't want to be the galaxy's rulers. They wanted to be its guides. The goal was not to lead with an iron fist, but to help each species find their own strength, their own voice, and their own place in this new united galaxy. The rebuilding process began on a planet called Illyria, a world that had been devastated by the Council's military campaigns. It was here that the first true test of humanity's new leadership would unfold. The planet had been reduced to ruins, its once proud cities, now nothing more than crumbling structures and dust. The inhabitants, a species known as the Elvians, had suffered under the Council's regime for centuries. They were wary of the humans, unsure whether they could trust another species, no matter how well-intentioned. But humanity wasn't in a rush to rebuild. They didn't want to force their vision on Illyria. They wanted to listen, to understand, and to work with the Elvians to determine what the future should look like. The humans, once again, found themselves in a role that was unfamiliar to many of the galaxy's inhabitants, the role of mediator and helper. They didn't have all the answers, but they were determined to find solutions together. At first, the Elvians were hesitant. They had been oppressed for so long that the idea of working with another species, especially humans, felt alien. But as humanity's leaders sat with them, listening to their needs and working alongside them, something started to change. The Elvians realized that humanity was different. They weren't there to impose their will. They were there to help. They worked side by side with the Elvians, providing them with resources and knowledge, not as conquerors, but as partners. Slowly, the atmosphere on Illyria began to change. The once skeptical Elvians began to trust the humans. They saw that humanity didn't need to dominate in order to bring about change. They simply needed to inspire, to teach, and to support. In the following years, Illyria began to rebuild, not just its cities, but its very sense of self. It was a long, difficult process, but the humans had shown that cooperation was possible. The Elvians, once broken and oppressed, began to thrive again. As Illyria healed, the message spread to the rest of the galaxy. Other planets began to look to humanity for guidance. The rebellion that had begun as a small act of defiance had now become a movement that inspired every species in the galaxy to rise above their differences, to work together for a common cause, and to build a galaxy that was no longer divided by fear and greed. The humans had not just defeated the Council, they had shown that there was a better way, one based on unity and mutual respect. The Council's former members, now exiled and divided, watched in disbelief as the galaxy they once controlled was transformed before their eyes. Some of them still clung to the old ways, unable to let go of the power they once held. But most of them saw the inevitable truth. The galaxy had changed, and there was no going back. Humanity, with their newfound role as leaders and guides, continued to push the galaxy forward. They worked to create a system of governance that was based on cooperation and mutual respect. Each species, regardless of its power or history, had a voice. The humans did not seek to dominate or control. They simply wanted to ensure that no one would ever again be left behind. They were not the rulers of the galaxy, but rather the caretakers, the guides, and the protectors of a new, unified future. The true victory, humanity realized, was not in the defeat of the Council, but in the creation of a galaxy where every species had the opportunity to thrive. The battle for freedom had been won, but the battle for unity and peace was just beginning. The humans had set the stage for a new era, one where cooperation, compassion, and understanding would guide the galaxy forward. They had proven that even the smallest voice, the most overlooked species, could change the course of history. And as the years passed, the galaxy began to heal. The scars of war slowly faded, replaced by a new hope, a hope that, together, the galaxy could overcome any challenge, face any threat, and build a future that was brighter than anyone had ever dared to imagine. Humanity had not just saved the galaxy, they had changed it. And in doing so, they had shown the stars that no matter how dark the times may be, there was always a way forward, always a way to rise, always a way to unite.